The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo examined the letter that would change everything. It was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli, recently exiled from his position as secretary of the Florentine Republic, sat in his modest villa outside the city, wrestling with ideas that would echo through centuries. What he discovered during those months of forced retirement wasn't just political theory, it was a blueprint for navigating human nature itself, secrets so profound that most people still ignore them today. These weren't the crude manipulations that popular culture attributes to Machiavellianism. They were sophisticated insights into power, influence, and strategic thinking that, when properly understood and ethically applied, could transform anyone into a significantly sharper, more effective person. The tragedy is that while millions know Machiavelli's name, almost no one truly understands his most valuable teachings. Part 1: The Architecture of Influence. The Paradox of Perception. Machiavelli's first ignored secret centers on what he called the paradox of perception, the gap between reality and appearance, and why controlling the latter often matters more than perfecting the former. This wasn't about deception, it was about understanding that in a world where people act on incomplete information, perception becomes a form of reality. Consider the story of Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli studied intensively. Borgia understood that his reputation for ruthlessness was more valuable than actually being ruthless. By carefully orchestrating a few strategic displays of power, he created an aura that prevented far more violence than it caused. His enemies surrendered rather than test whether the reputation matched reality. This principle applies powerfully to modern life, though most people completely misunderstand it. They think it means being fake or manipulative. Instead, it means understanding that competence without visibility is often worthless, while visible competence, even if slightly less perfect, creates exponential returns. Take the case of Sarah, a brilliant software engineer who consistently produced exceptional code but remained invisible in her organization. She believed her work should speak for itself. Meanwhile, her colleague Michael, whose technical skills were adequate but not extraordinary, regularly presented his projects to leadership, wrote internal blog posts about his process, and made sure his contributions were visible. Within 2 years, Michael was promoted to lead architect while Sarah remained in the same role, growing increasingly frustrated. The Machiavellian insight here isn't that Sarah should become a shameless self-promoter. It's that she should understand the strategic importance of perception management. Excellent work performed in isolation is like brilliant music played in an empty concert hall. It may be beautiful, but it creates no impact. Machiavelli would have advised Sarah to implement what he called strategic revelation, the careful timing and presentation of one's capabilities. This might mean volunteering to present her most innovative solutions to broader teams, documenting her problem-solving processes in ways that showcase her thinking, or finding opportunities to mentor others while demonstrating her expertise. The key is understanding that in complex organizations, decision-makers operate with limited information and attention. They must rely on signals and indicators. By failing to manage these signals, competent people often lose influence to those who are more strategically minded about perception. The art of calculated vulnerability. Machiavelli's second ignored insight relates to what he observed about successful leaders who knew when to appear vulnerable. This contradicts the popular misconception that Machiavellian thinking is about projecting invincibility at all costs. He noted that the most effective leaders alternated between demonstrations of strength and carefully chosen moments of openness or uncertainty. This created trust and relatability while maintaining respect. The key was ensuring these moments of vulnerability were strategic rather than accidental. Modern research in psychology confirms this insight. Leaders who occasionally admit mistakes, acknowledge uncertainty, or ask for help are often perceived as more trustworthy and competent, not less. But there's an art to it that Machiavelli understood and most people miss entirely. Consider David, a startup CEO who transformed his struggling company by applying this principle. Instead of maintaining the facade that everything was under control, which his team could see was false, he began holding monthly uncertainty sessions where he openly discussed the challenges facing the company and asked for input from all levels. The effect was remarkable. Rather than undermining confidence, this strategic vulnerability accomplished several things. It freed his team to surface problems earlier rather than hiding them. It created genuine buy-in because people felt heard and involved, and it actually enhanced his credibility because his assessments matched what people could observe. But David was careful about boundaries. He didn't share every doubt or fear. He focused on business challenges where collective input was valuable, not personal insecurities or fundamental questions about company direction that would genuinely undermine confidence. This reflects Machiavelli's nuanced understanding of human psychology. People don't trust leaders who seem superhuman, but they also don't trust leaders who seem overwhelmed or directionless. The sweet spot is confident humility, being secure enough in your competence that you can acknowledge its limits. The power of prepared spontaneity. Perhaps the most overlooked of Machiavelli's insights concerns what he called prepared spontaneity, the ability to respond to unexpected situations with what appears to be intuitive brilliance but is actually the result of extensive preparation and mental modeling. Machiavelli observed that the most successful political figures weren't just quick thinkers, they were people who had mentally rehearsed responses to a wide range of potential scenarios. When opportunities or crises arose, they could act decisively while others were still processing what had happened. This principle has enormous application beyond politics. In business, relationships, and personal development, the people who seem naturally gifted at handling unexpected situations are usually those who have invested time in scenario planning and mental preparation. Consider the story of Elena, a marketing director who became known throughout her company for her seemingly uncanny ability to turn PR crises into opportunities. When a product launch went badly wrong, she immediately pivoted to a transparency campaign that actually strengthened the brand. When a competitor made aggressive moves, she was ready with counter strategies that not only defended market share but captured new segments. Elena's secret wasn't supernatural intuition, it was systematic preparation. She spent time each month thinking through potential scenarios. What if our main competitor cuts prices by 20%? What if there's a supply chain disruption? What if we get negative media coverage? For each scenario, she developed multiple response options, considering not just the immediate tactical response but the strategic implications and potential second-order effects. This preparation meant that when actual crises arose, Elena could respond quickly and thoughtfully while others were scrambling. Her responses appeared spontaneous and intuitive, but they were actually the result of careful preparation meeting opportunity. Machiavelli understood that fortune favors the prepared mind, but preparation alone isn't enough. You need the ability to recognize patterns and apply prepared solutions to novel situations. This requires what he called flexibility within structure, having solid frameworks for thinking about problems while remaining adaptable in how you apply them. The modern business world moves too fast for purely reactive thinking. By the time you fully understand a new situation, the opportunity to respond optimally has often passed. Prepared spontaneity allows you to act decisively with incomplete information because you've already thought through the likely scenarios and their implications. Part 2, The Strategic Mind. Reading the Invisible Game. Machiavelli's most profound insight, and the one most consistently ignored, concerns what he called reading the invisible game, understanding the unspoken motivations, power structures, and strategic considerations that actually drive human behavior. Most people operate on the surface level, responding to what people say and do without understanding the deeper currents that shape those actions. They take stated motivations at face value, miss underlying power dynamics, and consequently find themselves perpetually surprised by human behavior that is actually quite predictable once you understand the invisible game being played. This insight came from Machiavelli's careful observation of political actors who succeeded despite seeming disadvantages. He noticed they had developed the ability to see beyond stated positions to underlying interests, beyond immediate actions to longer-term strategies, beyond individual behavior to systemic pressures. Take the case of Marcus, a mid-level manager who transformed his career by learning to read the invisible game in his organization. Initially, he took organizational announcements and stated priorities at face value, focusing his energy on what leadership said was important. His results were good, but his career stagnated. Everything changed when he began paying attention to what the organization actually rewarded rather than what it claimed to value. He noticed that while innovation was frequently mentioned in company communications, the people who got promoted were those who delivered predictable results and avoided risks. While collaboration was emphasized, the highest performers were those who protected their key relationships and information strategically. This wasn't cynical, it was realistic. Organizations, like people, often have gaps between their stated values and their revealed preferences. Understanding these gaps isn't about becoming manipulative, it's about aligning your efforts with reality rather than rhetoric. Marcus began adjusting his approach accordingly. Instead of pursuing the highest risk, highest innovation projects, he focused on initiatives that were innovative enough to stand out but safe enough to ensure success. Instead of sharing information indiscriminately in the name of collaboration, he became more strategic about what he shared, when, and with whom, ensuring that his contributions were visible and valued. The results were dramatic. Within 18 months, he had been promoted twice and was being groomed for senior leadership. His colleagues who continued operating on the surface level wondered what had changed, but Marcus understood that he had simply learned to see the game that was actually being played. The timing of influence. Machiavelli's observations about timing represent another frequently ignored dimension of strategic thinking. He understood that the same action could produce completely different results depending on when it was taken, and that understanding these rhythms of receptivity was crucial for anyone seeking to create change or influence outcomes. This goes far beyond simply waiting for the right moment. It involves understanding cycles of attention, energy, and receptivity that govern human systems. Just as there are optimal times to plant crops or launch military campaigns, there are optimal times to present ideas, request resources, address problems, or push for change. Consider the experience of Rachel, a consultant who learned to apply Machiavellian timing principles to her client relationships. Early in her career, she would present recommendations whenever she completed her analysis, often finding that even excellent insights were ignored or rejected. She assumed this was because her recommendations weren't good enough and kept trying to improve the quality of her analysis. The breakthrough came when she began paying attention to the rhythms and cycles within her client organizations. She noticed that there were predictable periods when leadership was more open to new ideas, typically just after quarterly reviews when they were assessing performance and planning next steps, or during budget planning seasons when they were making resource allocation decisions. She also noticed individual patterns. Some executives were most receptive early in the morning when their energy was highest, while others were more open to strategic discussions later in the day after they had cleared urgent tactical matters. Some preferred written proposals they could review privately before meetings, while others wanted to discuss ideas verbally first before seeing formal documentation. By aligning her recommendations with these natural rhythms of receptivity, Rachel dramatically improved her success rate. The quality of her analysis remained the same, but the timing of its presentation made all the difference. She went from being seen as a capable but not particularly influential consultant to being regarded as someone with exceptional strategic insight. Machiavelli understood that influence is not just about having good ideas or strong arguments, it's about presenting them when people are psychologically and situationally prepared to receive them. This requires patience, observation, and the ability to delay gratification in service of greater effectiveness. Strategic patience versus tactical urgency. One of Machiavelli's most sophisticated insights concerns the balance between strategic patience and tactical urgency. He observed that effective leaders operated on multiple time horizons simultaneously, moving quickly when speed created advantage, but thinking slowly when the stakes required careful consideration. This runs counter to both modern business culture, which often conflates speed with effectiveness, and popular productivity advice, which treats all decisions as if they have the same urgency. Machiavelli understood that different types of decisions required different approaches, and that mismatching your decision-making speed to the situation was a common source of strategic failure. The key insight is distinguishing between reversible and irreversible decisions, high-stakes and low-stakes choices, and situations where first-mover advantage matters versus those where careful positioning is more important. Consider the story of James, an entrepreneur who built a successful business by applying this principle. In the early days of his company, he moved with extreme speed on tactical decisions: hiring, product iterations, customer feedback responses. He understood that in a startup environment, the cost of delay often exceeded the cost of mistakes, and that rapid iteration was more valuable than perfect planning. However, when it came to strategic decisions, choosing which markets to enter, deciding on key partnerships, setting long-term direction, James deliberately slowed down. He would spend weeks or even months gathering information, consulting advisors, and thinking through implications before committing to courses of action that would be difficult to reverse. This dual-speed approach initially confused some of his team members, who couldn't understand why someone who made hiring decisions in days would spend months evaluating a partnership opportunity. But James understood that different decisions had different risk profiles and required different approaches. The results validated this approach. While competitors either moved too slowly on everything, and missed market opportunities, or too quickly on everything, and made costly strategic errors, James's company found the optimal balance. They could pivot rapidly when market feedback indicated tactical adjustments were needed, but they avoided the major strategic mistakes that sink many fast-moving companies. Machiavelli would have recognized this as an example of what he called veri tempo, the ability to accelerate and decelerate based on situational requirements rather than applying a consistent pace to all activities. Part 3, the integration of power and wisdom, the synthesis of strength and flexibility. Machiavelli's ultimate insight, and perhaps his most misunderstood, concerns the integration of what he called the lion and the fox, the combination of strength and cunning, directness and subtlety, consistency and adaptability. This wasn't about being duplicitous or unprincipled, it was about having a full range of response capabilities and the wisdom to know when to employ each. Most people operate with a limited repertoire of responses. They're either always direct or always diplomatic, always aggressive or always conciliatory, always consistent or always flexible. Machiavelli observed that truly effective people could access different modes of operation depending on what the situation required, while maintaining an underlying coherence of purpose and values. This principle becomes especially important in leadership roles, where different stakeholders, situations, and challenges require different approaches. The person who only knows how to be diplomatic will struggle when firm boundaries are required. The person who only knows how to be direct will struggle in situations requiring delicate negotiation. Consider the story of Angela, a CEO who learned to embody this principle during a crucial period in her company's development. The company was facing multiple challenges simultaneously: a potential acquisition offer that was attractive but potentially problematic, a key client threatening to leave over service issues, and internal tensions between the sales and product teams that were affecting performance. Each situation required a different approach. With the acquisition discussions, Angela needed to be simultaneously receptive, to understand the opportunity, and protective, to avoid being pressured into a premature decision. She employed what Machiavelli would have called strategic ambiguity, remaining genuinely open to the possibility while creating space to fully evaluate the implications. With the unhappy client, the situation called for immediate, direct action. Angela personally took over the relationship, acknowledged the problems clearly, and implemented specific remedies with clear timelines. Here, diplomatic language would have been counterproductive. The client needed to see decisive leadership and genuine accountability. With the internal team tensions, Angela used a more subtle approach. Rather than mandating collaboration or trying to resolve the conflicts directly, she restructured some processes to create natural incentives for cooperation and modified success metrics to reward cross-team achievements. She changed the underlying dynamics rather than trying to change people's attitudes directly. The remarkable thing was that Angela's approach appeared consistent even though her tactics varied dramatically. Her underlying principle, doing what was best for the company's long-term success while treating all stakeholders fairly, remained constant, but her methods adapted to what each situation required. This reflects Machiavelli's insight that true consistency lies in consistent purposes, not consistent methods. The leader who always uses the same approach regardless of context isn't principled, they're rigid. Principled leadership means having clear values that guide flexible responses to varied circumstances. The ecology of relationships. Machiavelli's understanding of relationship dynamics represents another frequently ignored dimension of his thinking. He didn't view relationships as isolated bilateral connections but as part of complex ecosystems where each relationship affects others, and where the health of the whole system determines the effectiveness of individual connections. This ecological perspective leads to sophisticated strategies for building and maintaining influence networks that most people never consider. Instead of thinking about relationships one at a time, Machiavellian thinking involves understanding how relationships interconnect, how influence flows through networks, and how to position yourself effectively within these larger systems. Take the experience of Patricia, a university department chair who transformed her organization by applying this ecological approach to relationship building. When she first took the role, she initially focused on building strong individual relationships with key faculty members, assuming that if she could win over the most influential people one by one, the department would function more effectively. This approach had limited success. While she developed good individual relationships, the department as a whole remained fragmented, with various factions and competing priorities that prevented coordinated action. Patricia realized she needed to think systemically about the relationship network rather than just optimizing individual connections. She began mapping the informal influence networks within the department, understanding not just who had formal authority but who people actually turned to for advice, who served as bridges between different groups, and where the key tensions and alliances lay. This revealed patterns she hadn't previously noticed. She discovered that much of the departmental dysfunction stemmed from two faculty members who, while not particularly senior, served as key connectors between different research groups. These individuals were overloaded and stressed, which created bottlenecks in communication and decision-making that affected the entire system. Instead of trying to work around these bottlenecks, Patricia invested in strengthening these key relationships and reducing the burden on these crucial connectors. She created new communication structures that didn't require everything to flow through the same individuals, and she made sure these key people had the resources and support they needed to function effectively. The results were dramatic. By improving a few key relationships that served crucial network functions, Patricia enhanced the effectiveness of the entire system. Communication improved, conflicts decreased, and collaborative projects became more common not because she had individually convinced everyone to cooperate, but because she had improved the underlying relationship infrastructure that made cooperation possible. The long game of influence. Machiavelli's most sophisticated insight concerns what he understood about building lasting influence, the difference between short-term tactical wins and long-term strategic positioning. He observed that people who focused only on immediate victories often undermined their long-term effectiveness, while those who played the long game created cumulative advantages that eventually became overwhelming. This long-term perspective requires a different approach to decision-making, relationship building, and resource allocation than most people employ. It means sometimes accepting short-term costs for long-term benefits, investing in capabilities and relationships before you need them, and building reputation and credibility as strategic assets. Consider the story of Robert, a young lawyer who built an extraordinarily successful practice by applying long-term thinking to client relationships and professional development. Early in his career, he made a decision that puzzled many of his colleagues. Instead of focusing exclusively on billable hours and immediate revenue generation, he invested significant time in pro bono work for nonprofit organizations and community groups. This seemed economically irrational in the short term. The pro bono work required substantial time investment with no immediate financial return, and it sometimes meant turning down paid work from corporate clients. Some of Robert's peers questioned whether he was serious about building a successful practice. However, Robert was playing a longer game. Through his nonprofit work, he was building relationships with community leaders, developing expertise in areas that would become increasingly important, and establishing a reputation for integrity and competence that extended far beyond the legal community. Over time, these investments began paying compound returns. The community leaders he had worked with for free became sources of referrals when they moved to corporate positions or served on boards. The expertise he had developed through nonprofit work became valuable as corporations faced increasing regulatory scrutiny in those areas. His reputation for integrity made potential clients more comfortable choosing him over competitors who might have been technically qualified but lacked that established credibility. Within 10 years, Robert's practice was thriving in ways that purely transactional approaches to client development could never have achieved. He had built what Machiavelli would have called structural influence advantages that didn't depend on continuous effort to maintain but rather created their own momentum. The key insight is that influence, like compound interest, creates exponential returns when properly cultivated over time. But, like compound interest, it requires patience and the ability to delay gratification in favor of long-term accumulation. The integration of personal and professional power. Machiavelli's final insight concerns the relationship between personal development and external effectiveness. He understood that sustainable influence required what he called inner sovereignty, the ability to maintain clarity of purpose and emotional equilibrium regardless of external circumstances. This isn't about suppressing emotions or becoming coldly calculating. It's about developing the psychological resources that allow you to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively, to maintain perspective during both successes and setbacks, and to stay focused on long-term objectives even when facing short-term pressures. The modern world creates constant demands for immediate responses, emotional reactions, and attention to urgent but not necessarily important matters. People who lack inner sovereignty find themselves constantly reactive, responding to the latest crisis or opportunity without maintaining coherent direction. Consider the transformation of Michael, a technology executive who learned to apply this principle during a particularly challenging period in his career. His company was going through a major reorganization, his role was uncertain, and he was dealing with significant pressure from multiple directions, demanding board members, stressed employees, and aggressive competitors. Initially, Michael found himself in constant reactive mode, responding urgently to each crisis as it arose, working longer hours but feeling less effective, and experiencing increasing stress that was affecting both his performance and his personal life. He was losing the ability to think strategically because he was entirely focused on immediate tactical responses. The turning point came when Michael implemented what he called sovereignty practices, regular routines designed to maintain perspective and emotional equilibrium regardless of external circumstances. This included daily reflection time to distinguish between urgent and important matters, weekly strategic planning sessions to maintain long-term focus, and monthly assessments of progress against core objectives. More importantly, he developed what Machiavelli would have called emotional discipline, the ability to experience strong emotions without being controlled by them. When facing criticism from the board, he could feel frustrated without letting that frustration drive his response. When encountering opportunities that seemed urgent, he could feel excited without abandoning careful evaluation. This inner work translated directly into external effectiveness. Michael's decision-making improved because he was thinking clearly rather than reactively. His relationships improved because he was responding thoughtfully rather than defensively. His strategic vision became clearer because he wasn't constantly distracted by immediate pressures. The paradox that Machiavelli understood is that the more secure you become in your inner sovereignty, the more flexible and responsive you can be externally. People who lack inner stability must maintain rigid external controls to feel secure. People who have developed inner stability can adapt fluidly to changing circumstances without losing their center. The synthesis, becoming 200% sharper. The transformation that comes from truly understanding and applying Machiavellian principles isn't about becoming manipulative or cynical, it's about developing sophisticated capabilities for navigating complex human systems while maintaining integrity and purpose. When Sarah learned to manage perception strategically while maintaining authentic competence, she didn't become fake, she became more effective. When David embraced calculated vulnerability, he didn't become weak, he became more trustworthy. When Elena developed prepared spontaneity, she didn't become rigid, she became more adaptable. These principles work synergistically. Understanding the invisible game makes you more strategic. Mastering timing makes you more influential. Developing both strength and flexibility makes you more versatile. Building relationship ecosystems makes you more connected. Playing the long game makes you more powerful. Cultivating inner sovereignty makes you more centered. The result is what Machiavelli would have called virtue, not virtue in the modern sense, but effectiveness, capability, the ability to achieve worthy objectives in complex environments. It's the integration of wisdom and power, strategy and execution, ambition and integrity. This integration creates what we might call compound effectiveness, advantages that build on each other to create capabilities far greater than the sum of their parts. The person who has developed these capabilities doesn't just become incrementally better, they become qualitatively different in their ability to navigate challenges, influence outcomes, and achieve objectives. The promise of becoming 200% sharper isn't hyperbole, it reflects the exponential returns that come from systematic development of sophisticated capabilities. Most people operate with a fraction of their potential effectiveness because they've never learned to see and navigate the deeper patterns that govern human systems. Machiavelli's secrets remain ignored not because they're difficult to understand intellectually, but because they require patient practice and psychological development that most people aren't willing to undertake. They demand the integration of analytical thinking with emotional intelligence, strategic patience with tactical responsiveness, personal development with professional effectiveness. But, for those willing to undertake this development, the rewards extend far beyond career success or material achievement. They include the satisfaction of operating with greater wisdom, the confidence that comes from developed capability, and the freedom that comes from understanding rather than being mystified by the forces that shape human interactions. In a world that increasingly rewards sophistication over simplicity, strategic thinking over reactive response, and integrated development over specialized skills, Machiavelli's insights become not just relevant but essential. The question isn't whether these principles work, it's whether you're willing to develop the capabilities necessary to apply them effectively. The choice, as Machiavelli understood, is always yours. But the consequences of that choice, for your effectiveness, your influence, and your ability to achieve what matters most to you, will compound over time in ways that make the initial investment seem trivial by comparison. Fortune, as he famously observed, favors the prepared. But preparation, as his deeper insights reveal, involves far more than most people imagine. It requires nothing less than the systematic development of wisdom, capability, and inner sovereignty that allows you to operate effectively regardless of the circumstances you encounter. That development begins with understanding that the game being played is far more sophisticated than it appears on the surface. It continues with patient practice of principles that may seem counterintuitive at first. And it culminates in the integration of capabilities that transform not just what you can achieve, but who you become in the process of achieving it. This is the true promise of Machiavellian wisdom, not the cynical manipulation that popular culture suggests, but the sophisticated effectiveness that comes from deeply understanding both human nature and your own capabilities, then applying that understanding with integrity and purpose toward objectives worthy of your efforts. The secrets are no longer hidden. The question is what you will do with them.